Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 5 of Import Nights, the review series for GranTurismo's pretty broad selection and a very strong selection, both in terms of what they're capable of and their fan base, which is often also a very vocal fan base, of import Japanese performance cars. And in this particular pick we're featuring a model which gets slightly more overlooked on GranTurismo. It does have fans, but nowhere near as many of the other big dogs of the category. And it's interestingly a front-wheel drive JDM car. Now when you think of front-wheel drive JDM cars, you commonly think of a similar amount of them. The Integra, the Civic, maybe the Mitsubishi Eclipse. But apart from that, there's not necessarily a huge amount that come to mind to many people. Those are the obvious choices. This car, though, is actually a very interesting alternative. And in some cases it's actually superior to those models which usually come to mind first. And the car is, of course, the Mitsubishi Fto, a car which, as far as I'm concerned, looks fantastic. I think it's a great car design, relatively simple but really good looking. Mitsubishi has made some really fantastic looking cars over the years. My personal favourite Mitsubishi being the Eclipse, but in particular the model which is not featured on the game, the GSX, with the slightly revised front end with the large intercooler. This car, though, I think has always been a very good looking car. In terms of sales, it did pretty well here in the UK, I'm not sure about anywhere else, but it's just not really the kind of car which comes to mind as your first choice, or not for most people anyway, certainly not in the overall JDM category, but more specifically for front-wheel drive performance cars. Now, I kind of wish that they'd have made an all-wheel drive model of this, Mitsubishi Fto Evo, if you will, but they didn't, as far as I'm aware. The production models are all front-wheel drive, and there are a pretty broad selection of Ftos on the game, some with more power, some with less, and the model in particular that we're reviewing in this episode is pretty much the top of the line. It's the Fto Gp Version R. And this car, when fully tuned, has a very impressive spec. Now, it doesn't have the sheer power of something like a Supra, a GTO, a Skyline, or anything like that. But what it does have, it works very well with. And this is one of those cars, kind of like the Integra DC5, that does a lot with what it's given. Now, for a start, being front-wheel drive can potentially give you an interesting weight advantage, and in the case of this car, it does. This car, for more reasons than just being front-wheel drive, but that certainly helps, is extremely lightweight. It's even lighter, in fact, than the Integra DC5, which is already a very lightweight car. This Fto with the full weight loss package only weighs a seriously impressive 962 kilos. The engine, which is a 2-litre turbo, can be tuned up to 414 horsepower, which is not bad at all, and as far as torque, it puts out 257 foot-pounds. So as I said, it doesn't have the sheer power of many of the other cars in the series, but 414 horsepower is not bad, and combine that with such a low weight, and you could potentially have yourself a pretty decent track car. Now, as far as horsepower per tonne, it's not ridiculously high at 430, but perfectly respectable given that it has less power to work with. As far as PP, I would say it's pretty well placed. Fully tuned it sits at 520, so it's not too high. Then again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using it at that level, because you can get cars with significantly more power than that at that level. For a level of around, say, 450 to 500 PP though, my personal model sitting at 475, it's a very effective track weapon. You can run its lowest possible weight with around 300 horsepower at the 475 PP level, and that's a pretty good combination of low weight and high power, in respective of its PP, of course. As far as price, it's very cheap. 21 grand for this model, which, as we said, is essentially the best model in the game, is pretty good value, especially with such performance potential. So the question is, how does it perform? Because on paper it's good, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's good in practice. Well, in a straight line, As you'd expect with 414 horsepower, it's not the quickest of cars. The front-wheel drive means that it doesn't launch as quick as some others. It is more inclined to wheel spin off the line. The mid-range acceleration is pretty good because it's got hardly any weight to carry, and the top-end performance is not going to set any records, but it's good enough for most tracks against most of its typical rivals. The main thing is the handling, and on the FTO I would say the handling is very good. Front-wheel drive coupes offer a completely different kind of handling to many of their European and American rear-wheel drive or even all-wheel drive rivals. A rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive sports coupe will pretty much always handle in a very similar way. You can predict what they're going to feel like pretty well. With a front-wheel drive coupe, it makes the car instantly completely different. And it's not just the Japanese that have done that. There have been some notable front-wheel drive European and also American sports coupes, such as the Chevy Cobalt SS from America and various others, which are not bad cars. But Japan has probably more of them than most other countries. It's a popular choice to go for, and the advantages that they give you are notable. The Mitsubishi Fto, for instance, as well as being lightweight and reasonably powerful, handles far better, I would say, than it would if it were a rear-wheel drive car. Now, if it were a rear-wheel drive car, or even an all-wheel drive car, it certainly wouldn't have bad handling. The Fto, I think, would always be a good handling car regardless of its drivetrain type. But being a front-wheel drive car does give it some very specific advantages. You can throw the car through corners with far more reckless abandon than a rear-wheel drive car, where you'd have to be careful of spinning the tail out, catching the curb, etc. Whereas with a front-wheel drive car, the Fto in particular in this occasion, you don't really need to worry about that. The car will always bring itself back into line. Now, of course, you can crash, you can potentially spin out in some circumstances, but it's a lot more difficult to lose control of a front-wheel drive car than it is a rear-wheel drive, because the car's always pulling itself along rather than pushing the car with the rear wheels. Overall, I would say that this particular model of the Fto, and to some degree all of them, but this is arguably the better model to go for, offer some very interesting alternatives to the more obvious choices from Honda, etc. So if you are looking for something a bit different, I would definitely recommend checking out the Fto. But that's it overall for this particular episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.